understood. I'll create a single, continuous 5,000-word professional crime documentary script in a formal, engaging style. It will thoroughly recount the case, exploring the crimes, investigations, trials, failures, breakthroughs, legal implications, and legacy. It will read as a documentary narration, smooth, descriptive, without headings, titles, or direct personal naming beyond what is necessary for clarity. Because of the length, I'll generate the full script in one uninterrupted flow for you here. The account begins in a coastal English city during the mid-1980s, where a community of working families lived in quiet neighborhoods surrounded by fields, hills, and wooded parks. It was the sort of place where children played freely outdoors, trusted by their parents to return home safely by nightfall. Yet, beneath the ordinariness, an unspeakable crime was about to unfold that would leave scars lasting for decades. 2 young girls failed to return home one October evening. At first, relatives hoped that they might have been delayed, distracted by play, or perhaps spent longer than expected with friends. As darkness descended, however, worry transformed into fear. The police were informed, neighbors gathered, and searches began almost immediately. Through the night, officers, family members, and residents scoured the local parkland and surrounding streets. The following afternoon, the worst fears were confirmed. The children were discovered in a secluded clearing within a wooded park, lying side by side. They had been strangled. Their arrangement appeared deliberate, a grotesque mimicry of peaceful rest. The horror of the discovery reverberated across the city. News outlets seized upon the story, calling it the Babes in the Wood murders. It captured both the vulnerability of the victims and the brutality of their fate. For their families, grief was compounded by disbelief that such violence could occur so close to home, in a community where children were considered safe to wander the local park. The investigation that followed was one of the largest ever mounted in the region. Police interviewed thousands of individuals, cataloged sightings, gathered fibers, soil, and clothing samples. They pieced together movements, searching for inconsistencies. Among the names repeatedly emerging was that of a man known locally for petty crime and antisocial behavior. He was neither a stranger to the area nor to the victims. Witnesses recalled seeing him nearby on the evening the girls disappeared. Others remembered him wearing a blue sweatshirt, similar to one found discarded near the crime scene. This sweatshirt became central to the inquiry. Forensic experts examined it with the tools available at the time, noting fibers consistent with the children's clothing and plant material matching the environment in which the bodies were found. There were also traces of red paint, unusual enough to draw attention. Investigators connected this to paint the suspect had been seen using on vehicles. The evidence seemed persuasive, and with mounting suspicion, the man was charged with the murders. In 1987, the trial commenced. Families of the victims entered court convinced justice was at hand. Prosecutors presented the sweatshirt as the linchpin, asserting it placed the suspect directly at the scene of the crime. Witnesses described his unusual behavior during the search, recalling comments he made that seemed incriminating. It appeared as though the case was strong. Yet trials are delicate balances of proof and doubt. When the suspect's partner was called to testify, everything changed. She had earlier told police the sweatshirt was his, but on the stand, she retracted the claim. She insisted she had been pressured, that the statement was false. Suddenly, the link tying garment to man collapsed. Without it, the prosecution struggled to maintain its narrative. Defense counsel argued there was no direct evidence, only coincidence and conjecture. Forensic science of the day could not establish genetic certainty. After deliberation, the jury returned a verdict that stunned the courtroom: not guilty. The decision devastated the families, shocked the public, and enraged investigators who believed they had the right man. Yet, under the doctrine of double jeopardy, the matter was closed. Once acquitted, an individual could never again be tried for the same crime. Regardless of new evidence, the suspect walked free, jubilant, proclaiming innocence, and celebrated openly in his community. For the bereaved families, it was not only grief, but the cruel knowledge that justice had been denied. The acquitted man capitalized on his notoriety. He gave interviews to tabloids, received payments, and even implicated others through insinuation. He publicly marched in protests calling for justice for the murdered girls, behavior seen by many as grotesque and cynical. Meanwhile, the families carried on their campaign, insisting that truth had not been served, but their voices were repeatedly dismissed. Only a few years later, another crime occurred that reignited the nightmare. In early 1990, a young girl set out roller skating near her home. She asked her father for a small sum to buy sweets, promised to return, and skated away. Hours passed without her return. As darkness fell, her parents grew frantic. Then came the knock on the door that would forever change their lives. Police informed them their daughter had been found miles away, injured, naked, and terrified. Her account was harrowing. Having become lost, she asked a man repairing his car for directions. Instead of helping, he seized her, threw her into the boot of his vehicle, and drove off. In the trunk, she pounded against the metal, screamed until her throat burned, and even offered him money to let her go. He ignored her pleas. He sexually assaulted her, placed his hands around her throat until she lost consciousness, then abandoned her in woodland, convinced she was dead. By some miracle, she revived and stumbled toward a roadside where a couple discovered her. Police investigating the attack quickly identified a suspect. Witnesses reported that the same man acquitted in 1987 had been driving a red car in the area. When police inspected the vehicle, they found fibers matching the girl's clothing, scratch marks consistent with her desperate attempts to escape, and items she had described from the boot. Biological samples further confirmed her presence. The evidence was irrefutable. The young girl was asked to participate in a police lineup. Though terrified, she clutched her mother's hand and identified her attacker without hesitation. The man was arrested, charged, and this time swiftly convicted. Sentenced to life imprisonment for attempted murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault, he was removed from society. Relief spread across the community. Yet there was bitterness, too. If the original trial had not failed, the attack would never have occurred. Years passed, but unease lingered. In the United Kingdom, a life sentence does not necessarily mean imprisonment until death. After a period, parole is possible. For the survivor of the 1990 attack, the thought that her attacker might one day walk free became an ever-present terror. Letters from the prison service confirmed that after 14 years, parole could be considered. She lived in dread, developed severe anxiety, and eventually agoraphobia, unable to leave her home without panic. While he was incarcerated, she too lived as a prisoner of fear. In the early 2000s, the legal and scientific landscapes shifted. DNA technology had advanced far beyond what was available in the 1980s. Forensic scientists could now extract and analyze genetic material from microscopic traces. At the same time, lawmakers revisited the doctrine of double jeopardy. In 2005, centuries of legal tradition were overturned. A retrial could be ordered if new compelling evidence emerged that fundamentally altered a case. Investigators seized the opportunity. They revisited every fragment of evidence from the 1986 murders. The blue sweatshirt was tested again, and DNA consistent with the suspect was identified. But questions of contamination during the original investigation raised uncertainty. Then came the breakthrough. Adhesive tapings, taken from the victims' bodies at the time of discovery, had been carefully preserved. Scientists tested them with modern methods and discovered a mixed profile. The DNA of one victim and that of the suspect. It was the link investigators had waited decades for. In 2016, the man was informed he would face retrial for the murders. By then, older, graying, and weathered by years in prison, he remained defiant, maintaining innocence. Yet the evidence was different now. Forensic experts testified about the tapings, explaining the improbability of contamination and the near certainty of the genetic match. Witnesses described his suspicious behavior at the original crime scene and his long history of dishonesty. The defense attempted to argue that his DNA was present because he had touched the victims while checking for signs of life during discovery. But officers testified that he had been ordered to stay away, never allowed within feet of the bodies. His explanation crumbled. The prosecution further introduced letters he had written decades earlier to a teenage girl, sexually explicit and deeply disturbing. They painted a picture of predatory behavior consistent with the crimes. For the families, the retrial was agonizing. They relived every detail, listened once more to the final moments of their daughters, and endured the arguments of defense counsel suggesting innocence. Yet they also sensed that the tide had turned. When the case was handed to the jury, deliberation was brief. Within hours, the verdict came: guilty. The man who had once escaped justice was finally convicted of the murders committed more than 30 years earlier. He was sentenced to an additional minimum of 36 years, effectively ensuring he would die in prison. For the families, it was vindication. They had fought tirelessly, refused to be silenced, and now their daughter's killer had been formally recognized. For the community, it was the end of a dark chapter, though scars remained. For the survivor of the later attack, it meant peace of mind that he would never walk free. The case reverberated far beyond the courtroom. It became a defining example of why laws must adapt, why evidence must be preserved, and why science must be integrated into justice. It demonstrated that mistakes and failures, though devastating, could eventually be corrected. And it offered lessons about listening to survivors, recognizing that trauma can delay disclosure, and that shame often silences victims, even when their testimony is crucial. The man himself spent his final years in confinement. Stripped of the arrogance he once displayed, his name etched permanently into infamy. His decline contrasted sharply with the resilience of those he harmed. Families rebuilt as best they could, honoring the memory of their children. The surviving victim raised her own family, striving each day to reclaim normality. She spoke openly of her journey, her battles with fear, and her determination to live fully despite the past. The case stands today as both tragedy and testament. It reminds us that justice can falter, but also that it can recover. It reveals the limits of law, yet also its capacity to evolve. It exposes the cruelty of violence, but also the endurance of love and courage. Innocence was stolen, families were shattered, and lives were scarred, yet truth was eventually brought to light. It is a story not only of crime and punishment, but of resilience, perseverance, and the long, often painful, pursuit of justice.